Ever wondered why Britain, a victor of World War II, was still paying off its war debts well into the 21st century? It's a story of survival, staggering sums of money, and a financial hangover that lasted for decades. Let's rewind to the darkest days of the war. By 1940, Britain was standing alone against the Axis powers. It was fighting for its life, but war is brutally expensive. The country was hemorrhaging gold and currency reserves to buy essential supplies, from tanks and planes to food and raw materials. Britain was on the verge of bankruptcy. Enter the United States with a financial lifeline called the Lend-Lease Act, signed in March 1941. The concept was simple, at least on the surface. President Roosevelt famously compared it to lending a neighbor your garden hose if their house is on fire. You don't ask for payment then and there, you just want your hose back after the fire is out. Under Lend-Lease, the U.S. supplied Britain and other allied nations with war materials without immediate payment. It was a game changer. This act allowed Britain to continue the fight, transforming American factories into the arsenal of democracy. Over the course of the war, the U.S. provided over $31 billion in aid to Britain through Lend-Lease. That's an astronomical figure, equivalent to hundreds of billions today. This wasn't just about military hardware. It included everything from aircraft carriers and fighter planes to trucks, food, and even agricultural machinery. Without this support, it's hard to imagine how Britain could have sustained its war effort. The flow of goods was immense, keeping the British military equipped and its population fed. It was a lifeline that kept hope alive. But here's the catch. Lend-Lease was never a free gift. The garden hose analogy was a neat piece of political marketing. The terms were clear. Any equipment that was destroyed or returned after the war had to be paid for. And when the war in Europe ended in May 1945, and then with Japan's surrender in August, President Truman abruptly ended the Lend-Lease program. The tap was turned off almost overnight. For Britain, this was a devastating blow. The country was victorious but utterly exhausted and economically shattered. Cities were bombed out, industries were worn down, and the nation had liquidated a huge portion of its overseas assets to fund the early years of the war. Now, suddenly, it was facing a financial cliff edge. The post-war relief was immediately overshadowed by a daunting economic reality. Britain still needed to import food, rebuild its infrastructure, and maintain its remaining global responsibilities, but it had no money to do so. The party was over, and the bill was due. This is where the next chapter of the debt story begins. To avoid a complete collapse, Britain had to go back to its wartime allies, the US and Canada, but this time, cap in hand. The result was the Anglo-American loan, signed in December 1945. It wasn't a friendly lifeline like Lend-Lease was portrayed to be. This was a hard-nosed business deal. The United States agreed to lend Britain nearly $3.75 billion. Canada chipped in with another $1.25 billion. Combined, this was a massive loan worth about $5 billion in 1945 money. The terms were tough. The loan came with a 2% annual interest rate, with repayments scheduled to start in 1950 and run for 50 years. But there were other strings attached. One of the most painful conditions was that Britain had to make the pound sterling fully convertible to the US dollar. This meant that anyone holding pounds could exchange them for dollars. The idea was to restore free trade, but for a weakened British economy, it was a disaster. When convertibility was introduced in 1947, there was a massive run on the pound. People rushed to swap their sterling for dollars, draining Britain's precious remaining reserves. The policy had to be abandoned after just 5 weeks, but not before causing immense economic damage. So, the repayments began. Year after year, decade after decade, a portion of the British budget was set aside to pay back its wartime allies. Think about the context. As Britain was building its National Health Service, rebuilding its cities, and navigating the end of its empire, this debt was a constant looming presence. It was a financial shackle from a war that the younger generations had never experienced. There were years when the payments were deferred. The loan agreement allowed Britain to skip a payment if its foreign currency reserves were too low. This happened several times, such as during the Suez Crisis in 1956 and other economic downturns in the 60s and 70s. But deferring a payment didn't wipe it out. It just added it to the end of the loan term with interest continuing to accrue. The debt just kept getting longer. The sheer scale of this is hard to grasp. The original loan was for billions, but with interest, the total amount repaid was much, much more. It's a perfect example of how long-term debt works. The initial relief that the loan provided in 1945 came at a very high long-term price. For post-war governments, it was a constant balancing act between funding domestic priorities and servicing this enormous foreign debt. As the years rolled by, the loan became a curious footnote of history for most people. The world had moved on. The Cold War came and went, the Berlin Wall fell, and the European Union was formed. Yet, deep within the British Treasury, the accountants were still ticking off the annual payments to the US and Canada. It became a symbol of that special relationship, but one based on a creditor-debtor dynamic that stretched back to the 1940s. Finally, we get to the 21st century. The original 50-year term was supposed to end in 2000, but because of all those deferred payments, the final installments were pushed back. The saga finally came to an end in 2006. On December 29th of that year, Ed Balls, the then Economic Secretary to the Treasury, authorized the final payment on the U.S. and Canadian loans. After 61 years, the debt from World War II was finally settled. The total paid back was around $7.5 billion for the U.S. loan alone, nearly double the original amount. The Treasury marked the occasion with a press release, thanking the U.S. for its support in a time of crisis. It was a formal end to an era. But it raises a fascinating question. Was it fair? Britain fought from the very beginning of the war in Europe, for over 2 years before the U.S. even entered the conflict. It sacrificed enormously in terms of both lives and wealth. Many in Britain at the time, and even today, feel that Lend-Lease should have been a grant, a contribution to a shared fight for freedom, not a loan that would burden the country for generations. On the other hand, from the American perspective, the U.S. had mobilized its entire economy to support the war effort and felt it was reasonable to be repaid for the non-military goods and post-war financial assistance. The debate highlights the complex intersection of alliance, economics, and national interest. There was relief and gratitude for the aid, but also a lingering sense of resentment over the harsh terms of the repayment. So, the next time you think about the legacy of World War II, don't just think about the battles and the heroes. Think about the colossal bill. It is a powerful reminder that the consequences of war are not just measured in the immediate aftermath, but can echo through economies and societies for a lifetime. Britain's 60-year repayment journey is a testament to the staggering cost of victory and a fascinating chapter in modern financial history. The debt is finally dead, but its story is one that definitely won't die. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. See you in the next one.